Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. Hey, Robert. Good to have you. You reached out via Harvard, and the career office was very much saying that you have to meet this person, and that's why we're here. And I heard that you have a lot of questions about Southeast Asia, so we're taking the opportunity to, go through the questions and hopefully share the answers as raw as they are, live as it is, with anybody else who may have similar questions as well. So yeah, Robert, why don't you just introduce yourself?
Awesome. But before I begin, just want to say thank you again for your time, Jeremy, and I'm excited for this.
Yeah.
So I'm Robert. I'm currently a senior undergraduate at Harvard. I study mechanical engineering. And for me, my main interests lie in aeronautics and robotics. But the main reason I wanted to ask more about Southeast Asia is because ethnically, I am Filipino, and my family comes from the Philippines. But I was primarily born and raised on an island called Saipan, which is a US territory kind of near the region. But pretty much throughout my life, I grew up in kind of an American context. So what I want to try to learn more about is basically the place where my parents come from, because potentially one day I see myself, I want to go back there and bring something back.
Mhm. Yeah, that's amazing. And I think what's interesting is that your story is not an uncommon one, right? I mean, I think firstly, the world is very flat. Before COVID and soon to be, once COVID is over, I think people are going to be traveling. But there's lots of Asian Americans who are traveling back to Southeast Asia. Vice versa, there are many Southeast Asians who have traveled to the States to study and to work. So, there's a big amount of flow. And, I think in the past, I remember my grandparents left China and, for them, it was like a one-way ticket, right? To go somewhere.
Mm.
They were leaving everything behind, their village, their family, but now it's not, right? You can always fly back, right? So, yeah. So I think, the truth is, Robert, there's a lot of people who have reached out to me over the past, few years, asking me about Southeast Asia and asking what's it like to go there. And also that I know lots of people who have gone back to the States, have gone back to Europe as well, or Australia as well, after the experience. So happy to share and answer any questions you have. So what do you want to ask?
Awesome. So I guess the first things first is just starting off with the market. So I did read more about the information you gave about what the current development in the market is like. And I just wanted to ask, so first is, what would you say are the skills that are necessary for someone who wants to come from abroad to work in Southeast Asia? Since from what I've read, that there's a wide variety of industries that are starting to pop up.
Well, let's tighten the question a little bit, right? And then bifurcate the question, right? So we'll tighten the question to be like, what does Southeast Asia technology startups want across the region? Which of course varies market to market. And the second question is like versus your background, right? Because you have a specific Harvard and engineering background. Let's jump to the second one first.
Okay.
As a Harvard engineer, you're going to be a hot commodity across multiple markets because there are very few people who have been to Harvard and are in Southeast Asia. Now, if you're in Boston or New York, there are a ton of Harvard people walking around. So,
Yeah.
so I think it'll be a bit surprising to most people around the world, but it's like being a Harvard MBA or being a Harvard undergrad is no big deal in Boston or New York because there's so many of them, right? Does it make sense? Like,
Mhm.
and overrepresented, rightfully or wrongfully, in certain industries like finance or tech or whatever it is, right? And especially leadership roles. So, I think there's a big dense network there. But in Southeast Asia, you're a Harvard engineer. Yes, I think you're young, but it's not going to be a problem. You're going to be able to find a job, no problem, especially in the Philippines. But and in Singapore as well, they would love to have someone like you. You kind of like check off the academic qualifications in an Ivy League university. You're technical, so you're what kind of engineering are you in?
I study mechanical engineering.
Mechanical engineering. So mechanical engineering. So you're not necessarily a computer engineer, which is a different thing.
Mhm.
So we'll talk about that. Sort of a bit of mismatch there. And then you're young, so I think you more importantly you have roots to the region, right? And so for many startups in the region, they're kind of like what they don't want to see is someone who's not very well qualified, someone who doesn't have relevant skill set, and someone who doesn't have roots in the region, right? Because that makes it worrying, because then you have a bunch of people who are not very well qualified who may leave at any moment. So I think in terms of your persona, I think you still be able to find a job. But let's then invert the script a little bit, right? Like, which is like, so why is it like, obviously people are looking for Ivy League, I'm wearing half a shirt, I think there's very few of these like top educational university institutions, and whether there's a signal for caliber, signal for learning capability. Those are the questions that are there. But I think the secondary piece of that component as well is the fact that there is a talent crunch in the region for highly educated folks, right? Just like Singapore obviously is very highly educated, but it's only like like 3 million, like folks. I mean, if you include travel and everything, it's like 5 mil. That's such a small, dent, right? If you look at Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, I think there isn't that many people who have gone to university still as a proportion of the population. So, that's big piece. On the second dimension, obviously, talk about mechanical engineering. So obviously, other startups are honestly looking for computer engineers, right? So that's another big shortage across the region, right? Because there isn't a lot of great, I think, firstly, there's obviously the local companies. For example, I had a chat with a friend, Oliver Segovia, and he was talking about the Philippines, and he wrote this great, analysis, which is, the Philippines, you have your local companies that you can work at. You can work for a Singaporean company or like a regional company that has headquarters, not headquarters, but engineering team outpost in the Philippines. Or you can work for a US company and you can work as a remote person, right? And all three of those things exist. So there's a lot of competition for that talent, if that makes sense, on one side, and there isn't a lot of generation of that talent either. Because almost a prerequisite for you to be a computer engineer is for you to have done university as well, right? So there's a compounding problem there. So low supply and high demand for computer engineers. And when it comes to mechanical engineering, obviously, then there's a different set of industries, right? You're probably not joining the crypto space, which is has a different set of requirements. You're probably not joining the SaaS, software as a service space, because if you want to play to that strength. And then, the third front, you have roots, right? So it becomes easier for companies to be like, okay, you're not someone who's likely going to like bail because you got confused by the environment or you got homesick or whatever it was, right? Which is a big problem for a lot of talent as well. So I think China, they call them, turtles. I think Southeast Asia also kind of use the word turtles.
Oh, really?
Like people swimming back, to the shore, right?
Yeah.
Because, that's a big target demographic, I think, for recruiters. Like they're looking for like Vietnamese startups are looking for Vietnamese Americans or people Vietnam who have studied in the States and come back, things like that. Yeah.
Actually, on that note, Jeremy, so this is something, actually, another question I wanted to ask you is about the work culture. And I did allude to the fact that I primarily grew up in the United States background, but I do have roots in Southeast Asia. So I guess the one thing I wanted to ask you on this note is, how would you say I can learn the culture in the sense? Because I do have roots there, but I didn't grow up in the place. And I guess this is something like, as an immigrant's dilemma, I would kind of call it like an immigrant's dilemma. Like, you have your mother country, but then you've also grown up a different background. And how would you say, as someone who comes from a different background but still has roots, learn more about those roots?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very common problem in the world today, and it's going to be more and more common, right? I mean, you're describing basically third culture kids, right? People who grew up in one culture, and then they, spend a formative amount of time in another culture, and then they're working in a third culture. So they're called third culture kids. It's a fun set of studies. Normally like the children of used to be like missionaries and business people, and obviously I think more and more people like that these days. And then obviously I think, um, the same problem exists for people who are, there and back again, right? Like re-entry, they call it re-entry shock, culture shock, but re-entry culture shock. It's kind of like, I don't know, Frodo, going out from the Shire, and he goes out to all this giant world, and he
Yeah,
comes back to the Shire, and he's like, "What in the world is going on? Like, I can't hang out and, smoke, tobacco
exactly.
and eat, multiple meals a day anymore now that I've seen the world," right? Uh, I mean, that story ends a different way. He goes to he goes to the land of the elves a different way.
Whole journey.
But I think at the end of the day, you just got to do it, right? It's just you don't know. Like you just have to. You have a lot of things going for you. You have you grew up in the Philippines. No, sorry, you grew up with Filipino culture at home, and Saipan is like somewhere in between geographically and culturally between the states and Asia. Now you're studying in Harvard. Um, Yeah, I think you just had to spend time in Southeast Asia and just do it. Like, I guess that's my other logo under the Harvard logo is the Nike logo. Just do it, right? Like you just had to go there, just immerse yourself. And I think the less interesting question is how do I learn and prevent culture shock of entering a third culture? Because that's not a helpful, useful question because you're gonna do it anyway, right? Like there's no amount of books they're gonna read that's gonna help you understand culture. Does it make sense? Like maybe there's some stuff on the margin. You can listen to podcasts like this one, which is what you're doing. You can talk to people via video call to get a sense, lay of the land, go do some reading. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do, I guess, beforehand. But they're all more like intellectual in a sense, but they're not visceral or psychological or even like spiritual, right? Like in that level of identity, right? So I would say just do it, just move, just hang out, and hang out both on the social and professional front. I think that is really really key, um, and I think that's one of the issues with I think a lot of com- a lot of countries in the world is I think they have that frustration is like with expatriates, right? Expats, right? It's funny because I think in America, I always joke. Well, one thing I realized in America is like there are no expats in America. We just consider them like people. Like you never say like, oh, there's a Dutch expat here. No, no, he's just a Dutch guy in New York, right? Think about it, right? Like,
That's an interesting point.
right? You never. There are expats. There are Japanese expatriates in America, but you don't call them expatriates.
Mhm.
Um, but if you flip the script and you say like, hey, you're in the Philippines or in Singapore, are there expatriates from America? It's like yes, right? So what? Why is there an expatriates in one domain and none in the other, right? And I think a big part of it is like the aloofness or the perceived power distance in that sense, right? I think the states like, yeah, you're an immigrant, but we don't really care. Well, for a lot of people, don't really care. But I mean, there's no, you know,
So it's like there's some kind of this social and I guess maybe potentially economic separation between those expats and the people who live there.
right, exactly, right. Because normally when the middle class in say Southeast Asia, which of course is like in an order of magnitude less than the states, unless you're in Singapore, because I think the middle class of Singapore is the same as the middle class in America in terms of like GDP. Yeah, yeah, expats are normally coming in straight away to the upper class, right? Because they're being paid US denominated, they're highly educated. And I think that and then they're coming to a good job on average, right? So obviously not all expatriates have that package or like, there's lots of people who are American and not on expat package. Um, so it's not just the description of the company or the package, but it's also a description of the lifestyle, if that makes sense, right? And the question is like, who do you spend time with, right? And I think no one's ever really trying to say like you need to go like go native. I don't think no one's trying to say it. Like you need to like lose track of who you are. Like Robert, if you go to Singapore, like people are gonna be like, yeah, you're an American, but you're Filipino American. So and it's okay, right? And I think you just have to look for those angles where you connect with the local population in a way that's normal and organic, right? So obviously for someone like you, I'm using you as a case study. You could connect on a Filipino basis. There's a huge Filipino tech diaspora across Southeast Asia, right? Community in Singapore and so forth, or you in the Philippines, obviously. You would also obviously connect with the American expat community, and no one is saying you should not be part of it. I think the American expat community is no, sorry. Any expat community is a huge bridge and a beachhead to get going into the culture because it's going to help you figure out stuff like where to get a SIM card, where to live, which parts are shady of town. And then, but I think where the differentiation kind of kicks in real hard is how do you get past beyond like race and nationality to deeper community ties. So, for example, I've seen like lots of people like embed in terms of religious and spiritual, right? For example, right? So, for example, when I was in China, I was part of that was like the international churches, and I was there, and there were also local Chinese people there, and that's how we connected, right? And build those conversations, right? Um, so I think spirituality or religious communities can in terms of your practice of faith, whatever it is a good bridge as well to embed. And then I think the next level in is like causes, right? I think a lot of people connect because I think I have one guy, yeah, he studied and he was a guest on the show, Vadan, and he grew up in the Middle East, and but he's also has a South Asian, background personally. So it's kind of like you, right? In the South Asian, grew up Middle East, now is in Singapore. And I think he's reconnecting with the local community because he's working on migrant worker issues, right? So he's volunteering with migrant workers. His job is now tackling remittances across borders, which is a good fit as well. And that's like a transcendental kind of issue, which I really applaud him for, right? Because that's something that the truth is not every person in the world cares about, to say the least, and not every person in Singapore cares about, to say the least, anyway. But within that group, I think they all care about the issue, and so it's a good way for him to meet there, right? I think then the next level in obviously is your workplace, right? You just make the effort. I think Americans have it easier to some extent because American culture is really the lowest common denominator culture across the world, for better or for worse, right? Due to Hollywood and everything. Like, you can walk to any room. I watched Wonder Woman 1984 with my wife, right? And my in-laws, right? And so, Americans can get to walk into the room and say, "Hey, what do you guys think about Wonder Woman?" And we can all talk about it, right? So there's a lot of shared cultural context in a colleague space or community space where it's much easier. Whereas it's a little bit harder, I think, if you're coming in as like somewhere else that's a little bit further that's not doesn't have as much exposure in the world or in Southeast Asia, for example. Like you grew up in Latin America, then some of those cultural shared touch points don't really are not as readily available or apparent, right? Um, and then I think one level in, and then of course is just like strangers and serendipity, right? It's just like how open are you to have conversations with like your cab drivers, right? Like honestly, I think for a lot of people in technology world, like not of the same socioeconomic class, right? And so I think that's why you have to kind of like, but no one's asking you to like jump in and just have that one-on-one conversation with them with no bridge or anything. But I was just saying, like, the truth is, like, that things that transcend class, transcend blood, transcend nationality. Like, although those are all easy shortcuts as demographics, the code for affinity, right? Because, you know, if you're Filipino and I love Filipino food, right? So we could go to a Filipino restaurant and eat food together, right? That's an affinity point. So I think, just that's really how I think I would encourage people to think about it is like, yes, do your homework beforehand, talk to people, listen to podcasts, join communities beforehand, so on and so forth. And then I think when you get in, obviously make contact with your local expat community and use them as a bridge, so on and so forth. And then I think rapidly move towards like integrating with the local population um, on the points you care about, hobbies as well as a good one, causes, uh, spirituality, friendships, serendipity. There's lots of different ways to code for it, and I think being explicit about it. And again, I think most people end up in a good spot where, no one is saying that, I think when you're an expat, no one is saying that you don't stay in touch with home or people of the same nationality affinity. But I think it's a good balance. Does it make sense? It's like, I think if you're like,
Yeah, there's the people you connect. There's the people like you have a common ancestry with, but there's also the people who are in the same boat as you,
yeah, exactly.
and they're the ones who can basically guide you to different places.
Exactly. So I think it's, I think it would be maybe like a gut sense, but like I think if your concern is about what the right balance is to some extent, like I think if you land in Southeast Asia and you're spending 80% of your time with other Americans, uh, or I'm just giving an example, other Filipinos, or other 80% of your time with only, let's say, your faith practice, or 80% of your time, I mean, of like one very hard coded thing, it gets a bit like, like, but I think when you're like the other way around, which is when you're like doing like 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, then I think that's like a rough way to kind of like get comfortable. Yeah.
Hmm. And actually, on that note, so I didn't mention this earlier, but for instance, for part of the primarily reason, so for instance, right now I'm actually learning Chinese, and it's part, and I feel I through my language learning experience that I realized it was another way for me to connect with the community. And I know Southeast Asia is an extremely diverse place. It's a vast simplification to say that, oh, Southeast Asia, everything's the same. No, it's not. But what I wanted to know more is how would you say that one could try to connect across different cultures, especially if they're more than open to it, aside from language, for instance?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the interesting thing about Southeast Asia is that, everybody is like from day one, from birth, you're living in a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society on average. Obviously, there varies across the region. And there's a ton of like, cross-trade influence, right? Vietnam is thinking about China, but it's also thinking about the US, right? All the time, right? And then to some extent, they're always thinking about their neighbors,
Yeah,
and they're also thinking about the Philippines and everybody in the region is watching some form of K-pop, or
exactly.
K-drama, right? And we're all using Japanese electronics and like Chinese electronics. So it's an interesting space, right? I think no, I think it's interesting where like in the States we can be like buy American, and in China you can be like buy Chinese, and in Russia you can be buy Russian. But for the rest of the world, it's like you just
You get a
buy
mix of
something. Yeah, you
it's a
buy a
mix of
mix of
different
everything.
countries.
Exactly, you're buying all these different things, right? Um, and so, I think, just look at the stuff I'm wearing, right? I'm wearing a Harvard logo that's from the States. I'm wearing a Nike, which is a US company, but this shirt was probably manufactured in Vietnam.
Hmm.
And I'm wearing, Apple, like headphones right now, and these are probably manufactured in China, Shenzhen, right? And
Hmm.
probably shipped to me via Southeast Asian shipping links. I'm using a Rode mic here, which is an Australian company, manufactured in Australia, right? And anyway, so there's lots of different things, where we're kind of like a mishmash of various things. And I think people are little bit more coded that this is the reality of that multilateral or multipolar or free for all, marketplace, right? It's like a global bazaar. I think that's what it
That's
is.
a good way to put it.
A bazaar, right? Southeast Asia is very much a bazaar, right? It's like you
Yeah,
go to a restaurant, food court anywhere in Southeast Asia, and it's like there's Indian food, there's like Indonesian food, there's Filipino food. Like it's a bazaar kind of like
like
yeah.
I can get a taste of a little bit of everything.
Yeah, exactly, right. And of course, no one's saying that it's a predominance of one thing in one place, but it's always a bazaar, right? And I just say like it's not too hard, right? Just like don't be an asshole. That's number one, and then number two, just be experimental, and then three is like take notes, right? First one is like don't be an asshole, like it's like no one culture is better than other culture. It
Yeah,
happened for a reason. I think there's a valid conversation about whether if we're trying to make a decision, business decision, which how do we figure out as a group to what the best decision is, and obviously everyone's going to bring their own culture, education, background, experience, leadership, personality to the table. And so I think diversity is great, to help make better decisions on average. I think that's been, you know, scientifically and research proven that diversity up to a point uh, is actually very effective for decision making. Um, And so, don't be an asshole, like, solicit opinions, go around the table. And then two is, yeah, just experiment, right? Just try different things. There's so many times that people ask me, like, try this, try that. And I'm just give it a shot. And maybe I don't like it. But a lot of times I'm like, I'm actually neutral on it. Oh, I do like it, even better, right?
Yeah.
It's just experiment, just hang out, right? And I saw a lot of people like, um, someone experiments and say, like, do you want to go to a festival together, or do you want to visit a temple together, or do you want to go on a hike in this, random part of town, right? Like, just try it, right? Lastly, just take notes. Like, I think a lot of people who are assimilating to a new culture to some extent, um, I think it's really helpful to take notes, and obviously not like a
Like a
like a
journalist, like
a journal. Well, those some people, but it's like 140 characters. But thing is, like, I learned today that this day is really important for people of this faith practice, right? Or I learned that I mean, it's the equivalent of like it's a huge no-no to wear shoes into the house, right?
yeah.
The equivalent of that, right?
Like take notes of the I wouldn't call them quirks, but just these small things that you just notice in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, exactly. And I think when people see that you're making an effort, when they see that you're not an asshole, when they see that you're willing to experiment and game to try, and when they see that you do remember the small things, then they think about it and they're appreciative of it, right? No one's expecting you to walk into, I don't know, for example, Singapore and have a Singaporean accent. No one's saying that.
Yeah.
Like that's trying too hard, maybe, right? But if you walk in and you're like, hey, I'm willing to learn more about all these different cultures and hang out with them, and go for poker with a few of them, and you know, remember that they're vegetarian, or remember that they need halal food and not pick a restaurant. Like, I it's like, you know one of the things I still work very hard is just like, yeah, I just need to make sure that I check for food preferences before the meal, right? Just
Hmm.
because, like, if you think about it, if someone's vegetarian for diet purposes, and if someone else is, Buddhist and doesn't want to want to eat a certain lifestyle, and if someone else is, Muslim and needs it to be halal, then you don't want to say like, hey guys, let's go for drinks tonight, right?
Yeah.
That's terrible, right?
The
It's just
whole
like,
group is not gonna have fun.
yeah, exactly. And then you're like, oh shit, right? And then you're like, and I think that's what people all forget, right? It's like, so yes, it's a bit more effort because now you're like, okay, how do we code for activities that could work for the group, right? But I think that's something that we all have individual choices on. And again, no one's saying that every activity has to be like open to all,
Yeah.
but across the portfolio of activities and hobbies that you're doing, you should be mindful and try your best to be as open as possible.
Like always take into account the people who will be joining in. But I'm amazed to hear about that wide range of diversity because that would I'm not gonna lie, this is the first time I've heard about it. And I'm frankly amazed by it and honestly really excited for to see it. But on the note of the seeing it, Jeremy, so I guess regarding COVID, because COVID is just the thing nowadays, and so obviously travel has is not easier now, and especially in these countries where they are getting hit pretty hard. I was wondering what is just your thoughts, if you're willing to share thoughts on the potential to be able to come to Southeast Asia to truly experience, just to travel there, see what it's like. What's your thoughts on that in the upcoming future?
Sorry, are you trying to say what the odds are of someone coming to Southeast Asia, or what? Sorry, I wasn't too clear what the question was here.
So I guess the best way I could word it is so I fully agree that going there and just doing it is the best way to do it. But the thing is nowadays with COVID and the travel restrictions, think that is not feasible, not possible. And for I guess for a lack of better words, a better way of saying it is just how would you suggest I can try to I guess learn more about the culture during this quote unquote downtime or learn more about the region?
I see. Yeah. How do you prep up? Yeah. So, I'm happy to share some, if you go to jeremyow.com, you can sign up to join the club. And at the club, we will actually discuss a lot of these Southeast Asia insights. And we actually drop a lot of resources for like newcomers to the region. So like if you're joining the region, these are like your resource guide in that sense, right? And there's a nice checklist of like, these are the things to read that kind of encapsulate the scene and you should be mindful of. And obviously your job is not to like read all of it because it's a lot, but it's to at least get a sense of like, and hand and pack the stuff that's most useful to you, right? I think a big part of it, and then obviously there's a discussion thread at, club.jeremyau.com where we discuss all this stuff as well. We also have a clubhouse with like almost like 10,000, members discussing Southeast Asia technology. So yeah, just join Clubhouse and join on our, free for all conversations, right? And listen here and I think hear the voices, right? Because it's not really necessarily the content that's important, but it's also how the content is expressed. And I think that's something that's so key, right? We all know that US and China are very big places, Southeast Asia. But what's more important is how do individual people talk about US and China in the context of Southeast Asia, right? Are they friendly? Are they wary? Are they suspicious? Are they paranoid? And the truth is, all those emotions can be true at the same time, and how that's framed is really important. The framing is really important. Give you an example would be like, I know a lot of people in Southeast Asia, and they would never talk about political issues the way an American person would do about America or about China, for example, because it's way too risky, honestly, right? To talk about it, because just because the person's American doesn't mean he's a Democrat, an expat. Just because he's an expat doesn't mean that he's not a Republican. Like, and we can't
don't
talk
make
about
assumptions.
Yeah, exactly. And as people as people who don't vote in the U.S. elections, we kind of don't have the standing to say A or B or C, right? We can talk about how their policies or their personality or their dynamics have impacted the Southeast Asian country. I think that's fair game, right? And the aspirations of Southeast Asian countries to deal with that issue. But, we're not. Yeah, I mean, it's a different dynamic. It's a different language altogether, right? And I think that's true of every U.S. president because the region is like seeing a new U.S. president every 4 years, right? It's
exactly.
like it's the weather, right? There's good times, there's bad times, there's up times, there's sideways times, right? So yeah, I think that's the reality. But same thing, China has been in Southeast Asia for thousands of years, right? Since the Silk Route, right? Zheng He's treasure fleet, traveled past the Philippines and, to Indonesia and Singapore and Malaysia. It's like Southeast Asia has been dealing with this stuff for like centuries, right?
Awesome. And then I guess other than that, that's all the main questions I had, Jeremy, at this moment.
Yeah. I mean, Robert, so tell me about yourself. Like, what kind of company you want to join in, Southeast Asia?
So, to share a bit more about my background, so it does say mechanical engineering, but I've had a lot of experience with software actually.
Right.
And the reason, like I mentioned, that I was just really interested in just working in different technologies. And I guess since I'm about to graduate and I'm just looking at more so the technology space, and I just realized how much I did not know. That there's just so much ongoing at the same time. There's like this cool stuff going in robotics, but there's also software as a service, then B2B, so many different things ongoing at the same time. And I guess what I'm really interested in, honestly, is just really working on technology that could potentially have an impact on people.
Right.
And ideally something in the field of robotics, since this is a personal passion of mine.
Right. Yeah, I mean, robotics, electric vehicles. Yeah, I can think of one name off the top of my head. Ion Mobility is a portfolio company for Monks Hill. They're building electric motorcycles, trying to become because their point of view is like motorcycle. A lot of it are electric cars in the States, but motorcycles are the primary form of transportation in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, that's one thing I remember when I visited the Philippines last time. A lot of motorcycles.
Exactly. So electric motorcycles make a ton of sense, right? Because you get to travel quicker. It's the range, all of it kind of fits. It's very lightweight. Yeah.
Actually, wait. You also, now that we're on that topic, it makes me realize like that's another cultural thing that I didn't like. If I just grew up here in the U.S. and just kind of analyze what's going on in Southeast Asia, I would never notice that.
Yeah.
But then now that looking at it, it's like, yeah, cars is definitely still used, but it's not the primary form.
Yeah. And I think the interesting part, when you're in the States, is that you're dealing with a lot of media algorithms to some extent that cue for the fact that you're American. That's one.
Mm-hmm.
But two, also, a lot of the content is shot by American companies for the American consumer. So if you watch Vice about
Hmm.
Philippines, that's not the Philippines. That's
Exactly.
the US Vice type of consumer, which is of a certain social political orientation on average. Learning something about Asia and Philippines, but in a way that's related to topics around that are relevant to American culture, right?
Hmm.
So I think Vice had an article on like the Philippines war on drugs, and then there's a implicit, not an explicit contrast, but there's an implicit comparison to the American policies, right? And that's not the Philippines. And so I think that's a very important thing. It's like I think a lot of stuff that people are consuming are not, in the eyes of the domestic audience, totally different, right? I mean, if you learn about China from American TV and movies, you're gonna think Crazy Rich Asians as a positive version, and you're
Yeah.
gonna think about action heroes,
Yep.
and you're going to think about it from a cast of like there's a long tradition of minority race characters, and they play the sidekick or different roles of ascent over time. So I think there's an interesting class I took on film studies, which was talked about that race component of it. But there's so much of it that prism is just coming through. It's hard to tell, but I think if you think about it, it's like if you watch Chinese movies about China in today's world, you will watch Wolf Warrior 2.
Yeah.
It's kind of like watching Rambo 2 or Rambo 3 for China. Does it make sense? Like,
Yeah,
it's,
I get what you mean.
and again, like, wow, like this is how the audience wants to see themselves, on the screen, right? Aspirationally or whatever it is, right? And I think there's so much of that. You just have to kind of like go for like really like local homegrown entertainment or voices, right? Which is exciting about podcasting, is exciting about Clubhouse and these things, right? It's like like in the past, if I was in the States, I wouldn't be able to. NPR wouldn't really talk about a Southeast Asian country unless there's another dictatorship or there's another
Exactly.
chance of American military intervention or whether we should come in or not,
Exactly.
or China's coming in and therefore we need to come in. It's so like American centric, right? And then now you have YouTube channels, obviously, that's geared around there. But I think this new set of media that's that discovery be there is really interesting. So I think that's the dynamic there where I really recommend people to say like, hey, like watch local television, right? Which is hard to get, by the way,
Hmm.
but India has its own Bollywood, Singapore has its own local like TV productions. And it's fun to watch. I always tell people it's like if you watch Phua Chu Kang, it's kind of like
What's this one?
it's like Phua Chu Kang is kind of like the Friends of Singapore. I wouldn't say Friends. It's like the Fresh Prince of Bel Air. I don't know. I'm trying to think
Okay.
of some. It's like kind of like something like that, right? It's a very like
Like a sitcom kind of thing.
sitcom comedy, right? But I think watching that was built for a domestic audience. They never thought it would go out any further, and I don't think it has. But if you watch that, I think you get much better sense of Singaporean culture than you have for most people. So I think being very explicit about your search for media that is truly homegrown.
Hmm. I will definitely keep that in mind, especially nowadays as I try to learn more. And actually, I wanted to also ask you about you, Jeremy, when you went. So when you did your MBA here at Harvard Business School, I was wondering is how did you? I guess one, was there any kind of? I guess first thing is what did you? Would you say you kind of took back to Singapore? What you learned at the Harvard Business School?
That's a good question. There's a different one from. So for those who haven't heard it, I do have another podcast episode on what I learned at Harvard MBA. But this is actually a good question because it's what did I bring back in contrast to the local culture. And I think the truth is that it's hard to disintertwine from the fact that I spent my undergrad years at UC Berkeley.
Mhm.
My father did some schooling in the US as well. And that after the MBA in Harvard, I also spent a few years working in startups, right? If that makes sense, in the US, in Boston and New York, and then later on expanding it across the rest of America. So it's It's an interesting question because it's like there's a lot of different experiences where things I brought from America and
Mhm.
different from different places. I think if I was to like zoom in one aperture in instead of saying like what did I bring back from the American tech scene to Singapore, or what did I bring back from UC Berkeley or Harvard to the US, but what did I bring back from the Harvard MBA to Singapore? I think the big eye opener was the intersection of America, Harvard, and the MBA experience, right? And when you look at that Venn diagram, I think the center of it is you have a very high concentration of really, I think from the outside in, really accomplished or rising stars. I don't think they're not. I think Harvard. I think people have this misconception, which is like Harvard MBAs are very accomplished, and they're not. The truth is, Harvard MBA alumni over the long trajectory history are very impressive. But Harvard MBAs who are when they first arrive on campus are right. You call them rising stars, right? Curated by the
Mhm.
school that they are going to be future leaders in their countries in business, and so it's interesting because they all had this. It's interesting to be on a campus where everybody around the world, 60% American, 40% international, like everybody has a seed for greatness, whether they choose to take it or not, and whether they want to or not, in whatever domain they choose, right? Whether primarily in business or something in sex or business, but in politics, in activism, in entertainment, whatever it is, right? Um, and so being in that high potential energy is like it's like increasing your battery capacity, like I don't know what you
Mhm.
call it, like, and charging it up with some, good juice, like,
Yeah.
like you're like, wow, I really kind of like, and then because of Facebook and the internet and all these things, you kind of like put all these connections and you're like putting it you carry it with you wherever you go, right? I'm still, best friends with, one Harvard classmate who was Brandon Reeves, partner at Lux Capital. He's a VC now. And um, he was my groomsman
Oh
uh,
wow.
at my wedding in Singapore, and then we had a double date recently via Zoom with his now wife and my wife, and I was his groomsman as well in California. So global, like think about it, like we swap turns having wedding, one in California, one in Singapore, right? You think about it
Across the ocean.
across the oceans, right? And we hang out and we swap notes. Um, yeah, so you see him coming from is a little bit like I think I've really walked away with a really solid network of great friends and acquaintances, and I think there's a bunch of people who, I'll be frank, like we were friendly, but we weren't necessarily friends on campus. But years down the road, we've found the opportunity to be helpful to each other. Obviously, that is not universally the case. Not
Yeah.
everybody clicks with one another, but out of like a portfolio of 900 classmates per year, yeah, there's a good chunk of people that I'm friendly with and or have helped or will help. um, and it's nice to see all of us now starting to achieve various things, right? Climb the
Mhm.
totem pole at Nike, climb the totem pole at Apple, join startups, found startups, fail at startups, have kids, have suffer personal losses. Like there's lots of interesting things and I think to see that not only in the States, but to see that across the world, right? Friends in Korea, friends in Japan, friends in all around the world is a really unique thing to have from the Harvard MBA experience.
No, it sounds like a very beautiful one, and thank you for sharing about that. Because yeah, it's not from what you were saying. It sounds like really that's one of. And I remember reading something about reading what you wanted to get out of your MBA was something along that lines, where you wanted to connect with people, but not just like purely network, but instead you really want to get to know them. And it sounds like you really did make the best out of it. And it sounds like up till this day, you still have those friends that they're just not just your network; they're actually your connections.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that you have now, Robert, right? I think a lot of there's a ton of like people in the, I'll say over the past month, I probably connected with 5 folks who are studying in the US. They were Southeast Asian and they are studying in the US and thinking about coming back or staying, or vice versa. They've grown up outside Southeast Asia or in the States, but they're looking at the region and thinking about opportunities. And I say, like, yeah, I think that's an interesting duality of perspective, right? Because into the future, you're looking at building the new connections. And in parallel, you're also nurturing your current connections and your current schoolmates and things like that. So yeah, it's an interesting time for everybody.
Mm. If you don't mind me asking, how do you maintain that? Because, like what you said, you want to maintain the connections you have, but also you're forming new connections pretty much as you go along your career journey.
Yeah, that's not an easy answer because the answer is that I think there's a biological reality and then there's a technology reality and then there's a work reality, right?
Mhm.
I think biological reality is like Dunbar's number, like basically like this like ten people in your life pretty much make up 80% of your life. You know,
Yep.
I think, and then the maximum number of people that you like actually probably know of, like 99% of your life is probably like 100 people. 100 people probably form up your um, we comfortably remember the names and stuff like that. And I think 1,000 is roughly where your brain starts breaking, a little bit, which is like, the name, but you're like, yeah.
The specifics are very blurry.
Yeah, very, very blurry, right? And yeah, so I think that's the biological reality, right? And I think there's the technology reality, which is we have way more than that. We can stack, right?
Yeah.
Uh, you know, like I have like yeah, like I have like over 10,000 connections on LinkedIn, right? That I've met, over the course of my business career, right, or life or undergrad or whatever it is, as well as people who want to reach out to me and get to know me, right?
Mhm.
As well as maybe I was listening to a panel and I like the speaker and I said, okay, I like you enough to send a connection request and say I enjoyed hearing what you said. And then if you're on Clubhouse, I have like 2,000 followers, the vast majority of whom I don't know, right? uh, so it's interesting, right? And I think that's me and technology wise, but you look at there's nothing compared to like TikTok, right? The millions,
Yeah.
right?
Millions with a 15-second video, millions of followers.
If it's like millions of fans, or Tim Ferriss, right? Hundreds and thousands probably, right? So I think technology helps scale those relationships because you can distribute and broadcast in a way. TikTok lets you broadcast 15 seconds in a way that's not irrelevant, but is relevant to the demographic, right? Things like that. And I think the third thing from a business perspective is, I think there's always a utilitarian component to it as well. Obviously, I think in the sense that obviously, it's well known in the business world. Like if you're reconnecting with me after a long time, you probably need something from me.
Yeah, there's that sense.
There's a sense, right? And that's okay because the implicit trade here is like, hey, I'm going to accept this request because I may need your help in the future as well. There's a trade there, but it's not a bad thing, right? I mean, I think we have to do so much in our life, right? And I define
Yeah.
work very broadly, right? Like it could be a cause you care about, a mission you care about, you're helping a friend, do something, you're trying to put together a poker night, all those different things, right? Like, there's some, need, ask and give, right? Kind of like trade or relationship building. And I think, if you build the relationship that's based on, the biological reality and the technology reality, you're just acquaintances, right? But you're not partners. So that makes sense, right? And so I wouldn't look at the business angle as a bad thing. When I say business, maybe it's like work or trade or help. Maybe more like a help angle. It's like, if you help each other, that's what bumps you up from acquaintance to a friend, right?
Yeah.
Like, if I met you and we hung out drinking, you're an acquaintance, right?
Yep.
But if you help me look at my resume and gave like 3 minutes of feedback, you're a friend, right? Because you helped me, right? And if I helped you with 3 minutes, then I'm your friend, right? So I think that's okay. So I think I wouldn't look at it as a negative thing as well. So I think when thinking about balancing like all your connections, I think the biological reality, like 10 people is 80% of your life. Probably 99% of your life is 100 people at any one time, and then your brain breaks apart at 1,000, and then technology helps you algorithmically remind those 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people, 1 million people, 10 million people, 100 million people, right? On Twitter these days, right? And to broadcast certain slices of your life, right? That's okay. And then the last thing is like, you have to think about the depth of that relationship, right? Which is, are you acquaintance or are you a friend, right? Yeah.
No, but that's a good way to define the friendship. I've never thought of it that way before, but thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're coming up on time here. So, Robert, feel free to ask me one last question before we wrap things up.
So first, thank you for sharing your life story one because that was really interesting. And you mentioned something about the you one time you while you're doing your MBA, you wrote about your goals. And I was wondering if you have any goals during this. Like has what is some if you're willing to share, what are some of your new goals? Especially well, it's Chinese New Year that just passed by and it is
so,
2021.
well, yeah, there's the Western New Year with the New Year resolution, uh, and then there's the Chinese New Year, which does not have a New Year resolution.
Oh, it's not a thing.
But there's a lot of money being traded around, so it's actually quite a good contrast. Actually,
Yeah,
like
the
the
Hong
Chinese
Ball.
giving money to each other, and wishing each other. The presupposition is that we want you to make money. Good luck,
But
and my goal is to make more money.
good fortune for the year.
Good fortune for you. Be lucky. Whereas the American New Year is like, okay, let's make a productive, individual centric goal to improve myself, self improvement, right?
Mhm.
But of course, there's a lot of Lunar New Years, of course, across the region. It's Vietnamese Lunar New Year and lots of different things. One is, I've lost 10 kilograms so far.
Wow.
That's about what, 23, was it 123 pounds?
Oh, I use metrics, so
Yeah. So, 10 kilograms, and I've not 10 kilograms to go. And it's funny because I had gained those 20 kilograms across after I finished graduating from college and the military service. I gained 20 kilograms across like two startups, right? Or stress. And so I had to relearn my own biology, come to grip about my metabolism, but also come to grip about the fact that I can use like calorie counting and dieting as the other lever, and that is not an effeminate activity. It is actually a tool to be used, right? And so I previously thought that the only way to lose weight was through exercise, which is a very, a commonly propagated, I don't know,
yeah.
understanding across guys, right? It's like
Like
dieting, that's
lift
something
the
a woman does.
weights.
Eating salad, that's a woman thing, right? The way if you want to eat beer, it's fine to eat beer and eat, fried pork skins,
Yeah, just like lift weights, drink your protein shake, you're good.
Yeah, and then exercise harder, right? And that's so. I think there's been one interesting learning that I've had, and I'm halfway through the goal, and I have another 10 to go. And I think that's one goal. Obviously, another goal personally is like I have a newborn daughter, 2 months old.
Oh,
So yeah, so
congratulations.
thank you, appreciate it. So I just want to make sure that I enjoy my time with her. I think not necessarily be spending like a ton of time. Obviously, I still have work and other commitments, but I think my goal is that when I'm with her, to be present and not thinking about something else, and enjoy the moment for what it is, which is a little bit Zen or mindfulness or whatever you want to call it. But I think that's important.
And yeah, kids grow up because I do have a baby sister, and
Yeah.
just watching her now, I can't believe so much that time has passed.
Yeah, exactly.
So treasure those moments.
Exactly. And I think the third thing, of course, is I love to continue building out this podcast and community and make sure that there's a very strong set of conversations, if they make sense, that are about Southeast Asia, and not just about Southeast Asia for Southeast Asia, which of course is useful in its own right, but also kind of like getting granular about how founders can help each other, what resources are available for founders or those who want to found a business. Yeah, I think that helping operators understand their own career path, and how they need to change and what they need to learn. And even for VCs, to learn in Southeast Asia, to learn how to be better VCs or better partners with founders. So those are all topics that I'm very personally interested in. And I'd love to really get cracking and build out a very strong, not just one-to-many podcast, but obviously a many-to-many community around these topics, around on Clubhouse as well as on, jeremyhow.com. There's a
Mhm.
discussion board there. I'm working very hard to build out a club there. That's fun.
Hmm. No, but thank you for sharing all those resources. And yeah, because it's a great bunch of resources. And honestly, for someone like me, for my background, it's something I feel that everyone who wants to learn more about Southeast Asia should definitely check out.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Robert. It's been a pleasure. For those who want to learn more and see the transcript, go to jeremyhow.com, and you'll be able to see the transcripts on the club discussion threads, as well as any other analysis as well. All right. Thanks, Robert.
All right. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.